Welcome back to the Urban Herald.
Hello.
We are conducting a really dedicated, comprehensive deep dive today. We're looking into one of the most high-profile and, frankly, complex celebrity criminal prosecutions in, well, modern history.
Yeah, absolutely. The case against Sean Diddy Combs.
Exactly. We've covered this story right from the beginning, the initial civil filings, then those federal raids, and all the way into the courtroom drama.
It's been a long road.
It really has. And now, with the trial wrapped up and the official sentence finally handed down on October 3rd, 2025, it feels like we've reached a kind of definitive end to the criminal part of this saga, at least.
That's right. And as part of the Urban Herald team, our mission today is, to move entirely past just the immediate headlines.
Right.
What you, the listener, really need now is a full analytical breakdown.
Right.
We need to understand why the jury delivered that split verdict, what made them distinguish between the charges that actually stuck and the ones that, well, failed.
And crucially, the sentence itself.
Yes, crucially, we are dissecting the legal arguments the judge is thinking that led Judge Subramanian to that very precise 50-month sentence. Because that number, it's been debated so much, hasn't it? Some say too harsh, others way too lenient.
It really has landed in a controversial spot. So we're looking at accountability, but specifically through that legal lens. Let's start with the hard numbers. The outcome is defined by those 2 felony convictions. But the fact that he was acquitted on the most serious charges, that really reshaped the final result entirely, didn't it?
Completely. So the sentencing summary, just to recap, 4 years and 2 months in federal prison. Officially, it's cataloged as 50 months.
Okay.
And that came with a hefty fine, too, $500,000. Plus, there's a long tail on this. 5 years of supervised release waiting for him after he gets out.
And it's really important to note the time he's already served, right? Because that counts.
Absolutely critical. Combs has been in custody since his arrest back in September 2024. Yeah. So he gets credit for roughly 13 months already served.
Which is, a significant chunk of time off that 50 months.
It is. It means he has approximately 37 months remaining to serve, so just over 3 years behind bars from this point.
And as we kind of noted when the sentence first came down, that 50-month number is striking because, well, it landed almost exactly in the middle.
Right, smack in the middle. The prosecution, they were pushing hard, asking for 135 months. That's over 11 years.
Wow.
While the defense, they were pleading for time served, which would have effectively meant just 14 months total.
So a huge gap.
A massive gap. And the fact that the judge landed squarely on 50 months really indicates a very specific judicial balancing act. It seems like she acknowledged the seriousness of the behavior the jury did convict him on, but also had to respect the legal limits imposed by that split verdict, those acquitters.
Okay, so to really understand that 50-month sentence, we absolutely have to dive into the split verdict first. Combs faced 5 serious federal charges. The acquittals on the most serious counts, they fundamentally altered his fate. Let's start right there.
Yeah, that's the core of it. The defense's biggest win, undeniably, was dodging those potential life sentences.
Huge.
Combs was found not guilty on count 1. That was the big one, the racketeering conspiracy charge, Arico.
Right, the government's whole theory.
Their entire theory of the case that his business, Bad Boy Records, was essentially a criminal enterprise. That failed. And, crucially, he was also acquitted on counts 2 and 4.
Those were the sex trafficking charges.
Correct. Sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, specifically involving Cassie Ventura and the anonymous victim known as Jane. Now, if he'd been convicted on just those 2 counts,
it would have been a different story.
Completely different. He would have faced a statutory minimum sentence of 15 years. That was off the table because of the acquittal.
But the jury did convict him on 2 counts, counts 3 and 5.
Yes, and those were the Mann Act violations. Specifically, transportation to engage in prostitution, involving both Cassie Ventura and Jane. These are the 2 felonies that led directly to that 50-month sentence, because each of those carried a maximum penalty of 10 years.
So this is really where we need to spend some time, isn't it? Because I think a lot of the public confusion really centered on this specific question. How can you be acquitted of sex trafficking, which sounds so serious, but then convicted of transportation for prostitution involving the same people?
Exactly.
That seems like splitting hairs, maybe.
It does seem like splitting hairs to a layperson, absolutely. But legally, it's like a canyon separating 2 very, very different legal standards. And understanding that difference is key to understanding the whole outcome.
It seems almost counterintuitive because trafficking, it's a more modern charge, seems more aggressive. You'd think it would encompass transportation, right? But it's that specific element of force or control that makes the difference.
Precisely. The same trafficking statute, the TVPA, it's incredibly powerful, yes. But, and this is the crucial part, it requires the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the use of specific things. Force, fraud, or coercion.
Yeah.
One of those three used to compel a person into commercial sex acts. The burden of proof is set exceptionally high because the penalty, that 15-year minimum, is so severe.
And the defense really zeroed in on that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They seized on all the nuances of these long-term, complicated relationships. They used evidence, like text messages showing genuine affection sometimes, or ongoing communication, to argue that while the relationships were clearly, highly dysfunctional, maybe even abusive,
Right.
the victims weren't legally coerced to the very specific high standard required for a federal trafficking conviction. They created that reasonable doubt on the coercion element.
Okay, so now let's bring in the Mann Act. It's a much older law, isn't it? What's the sort of historical context there, and why did it succeed in court where the trafficking statutes failed?
Yeah, the Mann Act it's practically ancient in legal terms. Officially, it's the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910.
Oh, 19...
Right. It was originally intended, sort of in the moral panic of the time, to prevent involuntary prostitution or the supposed trafficking of women across state lines for what they called immoral purposes.
Immoral purposes.
Yeah.
Very broad.
Very broad, yes. It's an antiquated law, no doubt, but it's been modernized over the decades by court interpretations. And crucially, its standard of proof is far, far simpler than trafficking.
Simpler how?
The prosecution basically only had to prove two main elements. First, was there interstate transportation? Did Combs fly them or drive them across state lines?
Which the evidence showed.
Yes, the evidence, flight records, hotel bookings in different states proved that pretty clearly. Second was the purpose of that transportation: prostitution.
Okay, and the prostitution part, the commercial element.
No.
In this context, it wasn't about whether Cassie or Jane themselves were being paid like traditional sex workers, right? It was about the nature of the whole activity.
Exactly right. The commercial nature was established by the other activities happening. Specifically, the regular, meticulous use of paid male escorts, with testimony showing rates often running from $700 up to $6,000 per session. That established the commercial nature of the overall activity that the transportation was facilitating.
So the Mann Act doesn't need proof of force or coercion.
Nope. That's the key difference. It only requires proof of the logistics, the travel across state lines, and the commercial intent behind it. That's it. Much lower bar.
So the jury, they're looking at this same mountain of evidence, all the testimony, the videos, the texts,
Right.
And they make a very technical legal distinction. They believed Combs was absolutely responsible for transporting both women across state lines for these commercial sex purposes. That met the Mann Act requirements.
Yes.
But they still held on to a reasonable doubt that the level of force or fraud or coercion within the messy context of those intimate long-term relationships met that extraordinarily high bar needed for a federal sex trafficking conviction.
You've nailed it. That distinction is the absolute crux of this entire case. It's what allowed the jury to find him criminally liable for his actions, hold him accountable to some degree. But it prevented the prosecution from reaching that 15-year minimum sentence they were so desperately seeking with the trafficking charges. It changed the entire sentencing landscape.
Okay, so the jury's confidence in making that Mann Act conviction, that was built on 6 long weeks of testimony and evidence. Let's look at the catalyst for all of this first. Cassie Ventura. Her initial civil lawsuit back in November 2023, that was really the earthquake, wasn't it? It shook the foundations and ultimately led to the federal investigation.
It absolutely was. Ventura's story, laid out in that lawsuit and then in her trial testimony, provided the essential timeline of alleged control. She was just 19 when she met Combs, who was 38 at the time back in 2005.
Big age gap there.
Huge. And her testimony detailed an alleged 11-year span of abuse, running from about 2007 all the way to 2018. It painted this really disturbing picture of calculated control, not just, messy relationship stuff or casual infidelity.
And the specifics of the alleged abuse she described, those were key to showing that pattern of control. Even if it wasn't enough for the trafficking conviction, it certainly seemed to satisfy that immoral purpose element of the Mann Act, right?
Oh, absolutely. The details were horrifying, and they were highly specific, which lends credibility. She described being forced to participate in what the sources consistently termed freak-offs.
Right. That term kept coming up.
Yeah, these apparently drug-fueled encounters, often involving paid male escorts, sometimes multiple participants, where Combs would allegedly just watch and film everything.
Wow.
She detailed specific drug coercion too, mentioned ecstasy, MDMA, ketamine, GHB substances, often associated with incapacitation or facilitating sexual activity.
And the filming, she claimed he used that as leverage.
Yes, she claimed the use of that video footage was essentially a form of blackmail, a way to keep her compliant over the years.
But the single most crucial piece of evidence, arguably, wasn't testimony at all, was it? It was that physical footage.
Yeah, the game changer. The May 2024 release by CNN of that surveillance video from the Intercontinental Hotel back in 2016.
Chilling footage.
It provided irrefutable proof of physical violence. And that was vital, even for the Mann Act charges that stuck, because it contextualized the power dynamic everyone was testifying about.
Right.
It showed Combs chasing her down a hotel hallway, grabbing her violently by the neck, physically throwing her down onto the carpet, kicking her while she was down, and then dragging her back towards the room.
He was brutal.
For the jury, seeing that must have crystallized the violent power imbalance in a way that just reading text messages or hearing testimony probably couldn't. It was visceral.
And it's pretty remarkable when you think about it that despite settling her civil lawsuit for a reported $20 million, almost instantly back in November 2023, Cassie still chose to testify. For 4 days.
Yeah, that's significant.
In the criminal trial, her cooperation must have been absolutely pivotal in keeping the momentum going against such a powerful defendant.
No doubt. And the systematic nature of the alleged misconduct, that was really reinforced by the testimony of the anonymous victim, Jane. Her testimony covered a much later period, right, from 2021 to 2024.
So more recent.
Much more recent. And crucially, it showed that the identical behavioral script, the same pattern Cassie described, was apparently still in use years later. It wasn't just a historical issue.
And with Jane, the coercion method seems centered almost entirely on financial dependency. Is that right?
That was the core of her testimony, yes.
Yeah.
Combs apparently established control by providing her with $8,000 a month to cover rent for a luxury apartment.
So not physical chains, but...
Gold handcuffs, essentially. Jane testified that these initial hotel nights involving escorts were first presented as optional, kind of like come hang out. But they quickly morphed into mandatory attendance through what she described as calculated manipulation and direct threats to cut off that financial lifeline, the $8,000 rent money.
So she felt trapped.
She testified she felt completely dependent and trapped. She literally said on the stand, if I left, I had nowhere to go.
And that pattern, it also culminated violently, didn't it? Echoing Cassie's experience again.
Tragically, yes. Jane detailed a specific violent assault in June 2024. She said it left her with facial injuries and potentially a broken rib.
And that was the breaking point for her.
That event served as the final straw, yeah. It prompted her to finally contact law enforcement. And having the pairing of Cassie's long-term historical trauma testimony alongside Jane's very recent, almost identical experience.
Powerful combination.
Extremely powerful. It allowed the prosecution to successfully argue for the existence of a clear, ongoing pattern of behavior, which was definitely helpful for those Mann Act convictions.
And then there were the raids. The systematic nature of this whole operation really came into focus with those simultaneous federal raids back in March 2024, right? On Combs mansions in LA and Miami.
Yes, the raids provided the physical corroboration. This is where the sheer logistics, the almost business-like nature of the commercial enterprise became incredibly sharp and clear.
Okay, let's talk about the physical evidence they found. The stuff that backed up the victims' claims about how meticulously organized these events were.
Right. Well, the detail that just completely dominated the headlines, you remember it.
The baby oil.
The baby oil and lubricant, yeah. Over 1,000 bottles recovered in total between the two houses, like 200 plus in LA, 800 plus in Miami.
Just an incredible amount.
It sounds almost absurd, maybe sensational, but legally it was concrete evidence. It directly supported the victims' accounts that assistants were routinely told to order 24 or more bottles for a single session.
Wow.
It proved the elaborate, almost industrial scale of preparation for these commercial freak-offs.
And they found weapons too, right?
They did. 3 AR-15 style rifles with defaced serial numbers, which is illegal in itself, and armor-piercing ammunition. Now, while that wasn't directly linked to proving the Mann Act charges,
right,
it certainly helped the prosecution paint a picture for the jury of an individual operating outside the law, someone willing to project control, maybe even potential violence, adds to the overall context. And critically for the victim testimony, they found the drugs, the very drugs the victims described being coerced with or being around constantly.
Ketamine, MDMA.
Ketamine, MDMA, ecstasy, GHB. Finding those specific substances on the premises corroborated the methods of alleged coercion and helped establish the environment in which these commercial sex acts were taking place.
But the digital trail, that might have been the final, maybe the most irrefutable piece of evidence, especially for nailing down those Mann Act convictions.
Oh, absolutely critical. The seizure of, 47 electronic devices, phones, laptops, hard drives.
Yeah, a huge haul.
Contained hundreds of explicit videos, which corroborated the filming allegations, but also thousands and thousands of text messages. And these weren't just, personal chats.
They were businesslike.
They were logistical records. Texts coordinating the hiring of specific escorts, negotiating payment amounts, booking the private jets for interstate travel, reserving hotel rooms, often under false names for privacy, even ordering the necessary supplies like the lubricant and drugs.
Wow.
This digital evidence directly proved both essential elements of the Mann Act, the interstate movement, and the clear commercial intent behind it. It was the paper trail, or I guess the digital trail, that laid it all bare.
Okay, so let's shift to the trial itself. It begins May 5th, 2025. Obviously held under this immense pressure cooker of pre-trial publicity. The opening statements, they really laid out two vastly different narratives for the jury to consider from the get-go.
Completely different worlds. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Jarrison, they really hammered home their central theme. Sean Combs ran a criminal enterprise, spanning from 2008 all the way to 2024.
16 years.
Yeah, using his immense wealth and power systematically to exploit and control people. They knew they had to prove that continuity, that pattern, especially to get the archival conviction they wanted. Their underlying message was clear. Money and fame don't grant you immunity.
Meanwhile, the defense, led by the well-known Tenny Geragos, they tried to kind of boil it all down, reduce the complexity, right?
Exactly. Their theme was essentially, this isn't a federal case. This is about love, jealousy, infidelity, and money. Human messiness.
Right.
They tried to frame all the activities, including the freak-offs, as part of a consensual, albeit maybe unconventional or messy, swinger lifestyle.
BDSM was mentioned too?
Yeah, BDSM. Complicated relationships between adults. They sought to redefine what the prosecution called criminal behavior as merely bad behavior, maybe immoral behavior, but not illegal.
But the prosecution's case, it seemed incredibly devastating, largely because of the insider testimony they presented.
That was the killer, really. The jury heard from, I think it was 34 witnesses in total for the prosecution, but Capricorn Clark, Combs' former chief of staff for 15 years.
15 years. He saw everything.
He was the linchpin. He was the man on the inside who knew exactly how the machine operated day to day.
And he corroborated the violence against Cassie.
Yes, he testified he witnessed Combs hitting Cassie, throwing objects at her. But even more importantly, especially for those Mann Act charges that ultimately stuck, he was the chief logistics guy.
He made it all happen.
He admitted it right there on the stand, organizing numerous freak-offs. He specifically detailed the whole process. Booking the hotels, often under false names to ensure privacy, hiring the specific escorts Combs requested, procuring the drugs, naming ketamine and MDMA specifically, and even arranging the post-session cleanup crews.
Wow. So his testimony provided the government with that crucial internal confirmation of the whole system that facilitated the interstate prostitution.
Exactly. Direct insider proof of the mechanics.
And Clark's testimony, it wasn't just limited to the sex crime allegations, right? He also provided that key piece of evidence for the ISEO charge, the one that ultimately failed, but still, the Kid Cudi incident.
Yes, that was a major part of the prosecution's attempt to establish a broader pattern of racketeering. Clark testified he personally witnessed Combs, back in December 2011, order his associates to firebomb Kid Cudi's car.
Just ordered it.
That was Clark's testimony. Apparently because Combs discovered Kid Cudi had dated Cassie briefly. And then Kid Cudi himself testified, corroborating that he experienced a home invasion shortly after, and then his car was indeed firebombed about 2 weeks later.
So the prosecution was trying to use that to show the enterprise wasn't just about sex, but also violence, intimidation.
Exactly. Trying to demonstrate a pattern of racketeering activity extending beyond just the sex-related charges, hoping that would satisfy the IORCO requirements. Didn't quite get there for the jury, but it was powerful testimony nonetheless.
And there were other supporting witnesses who further solidified the evidence, especially for the Mann Act counts.
Yeah, several key ones. Daniel Phillips, who was identified as one of the male escorts who participated in these sessions. He confirmed the patterns described by the victims. He confirmed the specific payment ranges he received, often between $700 and $6,000 per session. And crucially, he added his personal observation that Cassie often appeared visibly uncomfortable during these encounters.
Adding that third-party perspective.
Right. And then there was Israel Flores, the hotel security guard from the Intercontinental back in 2016.
It was a video incident.
Yes, he corroborated the assault shown in the video. But then he dropped another bombshell. He admitted on the stand that he personally accepted a $100,000 cash bribe from the hotel manager at the time.
$100,000? To do what?
To ensure the incident was never officially reported, to basically make it go away.
Wow. That just highlights the level of systemic corruption and cover-up that seemed to surround Combs.
Absolutely. Money being used to silence people and erase evidence.
Okay, now let's turn to the defense's strategy, which involved this massive, massive strategic gamble. After 6 grueling weeks of the prosecution presenting its case, the defense rested its entire case in under 30 minutes, called 0 witnesses. Combs himself did not take the stand.
It was stunning. A legal tactic born of, well, maybe high confidence in their cross-examination, but it carried enormous risk.
What was the rationale behind that? Why not put anyone up?
The stated rationale was basically the prosecution simply failed to meet its incredibly high burden of proof, especially on the coercion element for trafficking, and on proving the criminal enterprise for ICO.
So they felt they didn't need to refute anything further.
Their argument was that anything the defense presented witnesses, Combs testifying, could actually only help the government potentially fill in any perceived blanks or inconsistencies in its case. So, better to say nothing.
So they focused their entire strategy just on the cross-examination, trying to poke holes.
Exactly. Rigorous cross-examination, aiming relentlessly to damage the credibility of the prosecution's key witnesses. That was their whole game plan.
What were their main lines of attack during cross? Against the insiders, like Clark, for instance.
Against Clark, they hammered him on his immunity deal. They painted him as this disgruntled, self-serving former employee who was fabricating or exaggerating details just to save his own skin from prosecution. Standard tactic, but effective sometimes.
And against Cassie and Jane?
Against the victims, they relied heavily on presenting their own text messages, cherry-picked ones presumably, that showed moments of affection or expressions of gratitude from them towards Combs.
Trying to show it was consensual.
Trying to portray their participation as consensual, even if complex or transactional. Arguing these were flawed relationships, not federal crimes. So, by resting their case so abruptly, they were essentially making a statement to the jury. The government's case, as presented, is inherently flawed. It's full of reasonable doubt, and it does not meet the high standard required for conviction on these major charges.
But despite the defense's apparent confidence in that strategy, the jury clearly struggled, didn't they? Especially on that big conspiracy charge.
Oh, the deliberations were clearly intense. We know that because on July 1st, 2025, the jury sent out a note to the judge. They reported they were officially deadlocked on the IICO charge, count 1.
Hopelessly deadlocked.
Well, deadlocked at that point.
Yeah.
But the note also said they had reached unanimous verdicts on the other 4 counts, the Trafficking and Mann Act charges.
Interesting. So they'd resolved those, but were stuck on IO.
Exactly. This is actually a fairly common legal situation when you have multiple complex counts. And the judge had to intervene at that point by issuing what's known in legal circles as an Allen charge.
Okay, for our listeners, what exactly is an Allen charge? And what are the potential risks when a judge gives one?
Right, so an Allen charge is basically a supplemental instruction, a little nudge, given by the judge to a deadlocked jury. It encourages them to go back, reconsider the evidence, listen carefully to one another's arguments, and try to reach a unanimous verdict if they can do so without sacrificing their individual honest beliefs.
Where does the name come from?
It originates from a Supreme Court case way back in 1896, Allen v. United States. The main risk, and why it's controversial, is that it can sometimes feel coercive. It can potentially pressure jurors who are in the minority, the holdouts, to just give up their position simply to end the deliberation and reach a conclusion.
Which could potentially infringe on the defendant's right to a truly unbiased jury decision.
Precisely. There's a concern it might lead to a compromised verdict, rather than a genuinely unanimous one based on conviction.
So the judge has to tread really carefully when issuing one.
Absolutely. And Judge Subramanian, by all accounts, issued a modified, very carefully worded Allen charge. She specifically emphasized that no juror should surrender an honest conviction about the evidence merely for the sake of returning a verdict.
And did it work?
It seems it did.
Yeah.
The jury went back to deliberate, and shortly thereafter they returned with the final complete verdict guilty on the 2 Mann Act counts, acquitted on RICO and the 2 trafficking counts. The Allen charge broke the deadlock on RICO, leading to the acquittal.
Okay, let's delve a bit deeper now into the specific legal rationale behind that split, starting with the failure of the government's, well, its flagship charge. the ICO acquittal.
Yeah, that was the big one they wanted.
The jury ultimately found Combs not guilty on RICO. Despite all that testimony about firebombing cars, systemic organization, why did this foundational charge, the criminal enterprise theory, fail?
It seems to have failed because of the very specific technical requirements needed to establish a criminal enterprise under the IQ statute. Some jurors spoke anonymously after the trial, and they revealed they really struggled with proving two key elements: a clear pattern of racketeering activity and, crucially, continuity.
Okay, explain those. What does pattern and continuity mean legally here?
So to prove a pattern, the prosecution has to show at least two specific crimes from a list defined in the statute. These are called predicate acts. Think drug distribution, extortion, money laundering, violence like the firebombing. They have to show at least two, that these acts are related to each other, and that they pose a threat of ongoing criminal activity. That's the continuity part.
So why didn't the 16 years of alleged activity, violence, drugs, the sexual misconduct allegations, why didn't that meet the continuity requirement for the jury?
It appears the jury viewed Bad Boy Records primarily as what it was on the surface: a legitimate, functioning music and media business. A business where crimes, yes, occasionally occurred, sometimes serious crimes, like the 2011 firebombing or the 2016 assault.
But they were seen as separate incidents.
They seemed to see them as too isolated, or perhaps too far apart in time, rather than evidence of a single, continuous, unified criminal organization whose primary purpose was facilitating crime over that entire 16-year span.
So the purpose of the enterprise mattered.
Critically, the defense successfully argued that the enterprise's main purpose was always music and business, not crime itself. That distinction seems to be what created the reasonable doubt needed for the IACO acquittal. The high burden for RICO just wasn't met in the jury's eyes.
And that same issue, reasonable doubt, also ultimately doomed the sex trafficking charges, right? But there, the focus was squarely on that element of coercion.
Exactly. And this is probably the most legally complex, nuanced part of the whole verdict. The defense did a masterful job, from their perspective, of introducing reasonable doubt specifically about the legal definition of coercion.
How? By showing the relationships were long-term.
Partly, yes. Because the relationships with both Cassie and Jane were long-term, they were intimate, and the defense presented evidence, like those text messages, showing genuine expressions of affection, sometimes gifts, ongoing communication.
Which complicates the narrative of pure coercion.
It massively complicates it for a jury. They had to try and distinguish between what might be severe psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, financial pressure, all terrible things, and the explicit, legally defined coercion that the trafficking statute requires. Coercion that effectively forces compliance, leaving no real alternative.
Okay, so what is that judicial standard for coercion, specifically, that the government apparently failed to meet beyond a reasonable doubt?
Legally, coercion generally requires proof of psychological pressure, threats, or manipulation so severe that it overcomes the victim's will, essentially leaving them with no viable or reasonable alternative but to participate in the commercial sex act.
And Jane's $8,000 rent situation wasn't enough, even though she said she felt trapped.
It established clear financial dependency, absolutely. She felt trapped, she testified to that. But the jury, it seems, determined that financial support alone, even if it creates dependency, wasn't sufficient in this specific case to satisfy the high coercion standard required for a federal trafficking conviction.
So they saw dependency, maybe exploitation, but not necessarily the explicit threat or use of force that legally compelled the commercial sex acts beyond a reasonable doubt.
That appears to be the line they drew. The defense managed to frame the victim's participation as resulting from incredibly dysfunctional, certainly abusive, and perhaps transactionally flawed relationships, but not necessarily compelled by force, fraud, or coercion to the specific legal standard needed for trafficking. Created just enough doubt.
However, the Mann Act convictions, those seemed pretty irrefutable for the prosecution based on the evidence we've already discussed.
Yeah, those were much more straightforward.
Because the Mann Act, again, it's just about the logistics and the intent, not the compulsion aspect.
Exactly right. Remember the two simple elements: interstate transport and purpose of prostitution. The prosecution easily proved Combs knowingly transported both victims across state lines. They had the private jet records, the hotel manifests from multiple cities. Element 1, check. And the commercial intent, element 2, was clearly established by the systemic, documented use and payment of those male escorts, session after session. Check. The simplicity of the Mann Act's requirements basically saved the prosecution's case when the much higher complexity and burden of proof of the trafficking statutes failed them.
So the ultimate legal takeaway here, the reason for the split verdict really boils down to this. The evidence proved the logistics, the travel, and the commercial intent needed for transportation for prostitution.
Clear as day on that.
Even if the jury couldn't agree, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the incredibly complex, messy dynamics within those relationships met the extremely high legal bar for federal sex trafficking.
That is precisely the legal tightrope the jury walked.
Okay, let's move into the final phase then, the sentencing. The gulf between what the prosecution wanted and what the defense asked for was immense over 11 years versus basically time served.
Huge disparity, 135 months versus 14 months.
And this disparity, it seems to have revolved almost entirely around one specific and often controversial legal concept: acquitted conduct.
Yes, that's the elephant in the room at sentencing.
Let's make sure we address that critical legal term head-on for our listeners. What exactly is acquitted conduct, and why on earth is a judge allowed to consider behavior that the jury explicitly found the defendant not guilty of? It seems contradictory.
It does seem contradictory on its face, doesn't it? Acquitted conduct refers to criminal acts or behavior that the jury, for whatever reason, was unable to convict the defendant of. Maybe they acquitted, maybe a charge was dismissed. Now, a judge is allowed, under current federal sentencing guidelines and Supreme Court precedent, to consider this evidence during the sentencing phase.
But why, if the jury said not guilty?
Because the standard of proof at sentencing is much lower than the standard required at trial. In a trial, the government must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high bar. At sentencing, however, a judge can consider aggravating factors, including uncharged or acquitted conduct, if that conduct is proven by just a preponderance of the evidence.
Preponderance of the evidence,
Meaning simply that it's more likely than not, more than 50% likely, that the behavior occurred. Much, much lower standard than beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, so the prosecution asking for that 135 months, they were basically arguing, Judge, look at the whole decade-long pattern of abuse. Look at the violence. Look at all the alleged trafficking behavior the jury acquitted on. Look at the firebombing. We believe we've shown by a preponderance of the evidence that all this happened.
Precisely. They wanted the sentence to reflect the total alleged conduct, the broader harm, citing that long pattern of abuse and even alleged attempts at witness intimidation during the investigation. They argued the judge should sentence him based on the real conduct, not just the two Mann Act counts.
And the defense naturally pushed back hard, arguing the 50-month sentence was excessive.
Vigorously. They argued that the acquittals on the major charges, RICO and trafficking, severely reduced his criminal liability. They emphasized his philanthropic work, his contributions to music, and essentially argued that sentencing him based on acquitted conduct would undermine the jury's verdict.
And Judge Subramanian landed right in the middle at 50 months. A true judicial compromise, it seems.
It really does look that way. In her sentencing remarks, she explicitly acknowledged the undeniable power imbalance between Combs and the victims. She noted the troubling pattern of behavior that the Mann Act convictions clearly reflected.
But she also acknowledged the acquittals.
Yes. Critically, the judge stressed that the jury's acquittals limited her authority. She could not, legally or ethically, impose a sentence that truly reflected the 15-year statutory minimum that would have come with the trafficking charges he was acquitted of. The 50 months feels like a clear signal. The judge likely believed, by a preponderance of the evidence, that the actions went well beyond simple Mann Act violations, likely considering the acquitted conduct. But she felt legally constrained by the jury's actual verdict. She couldn't ignore the acquittals entirely.
The sentencing hearing itself, on October 3rd, 2025, it was marked by a very emotional apology delivered by Combs himself, wasn't it?
It was. By all accounts, it was a tearful, highly orchestrated, but seemingly heartfelt 12-minute statement from Combs.
What did he actually say?
He admitted he lost my way. He called his past actions disgusting, shameful, and sick. And crucially, he apologized directly by name to Cassie Ventura and to Jane. He explicitly admitted using the word, "That's not consent, that's coercion." He admitted using his power to manipulate them.
Wow, using the word coercion after being acquitted of the trafficking charges that hinged on it?
Exactly. It was this moment of full public admission, finally, of the very behavior that the jury had only been willing to convict him for, partially under the Mann Act. A stunning admission at sentencing.
How did the victims react to that apology? Were they there?
They weren't present, but their victim impact statements were read or submitted, and they reacted with, shall we say, considerable skepticism. Cassie's written statement expressed her ongoing trauma, her continued safety concerns, and she pointedly noted that his remorse seemed to correlate perfectly with the immediate prospect of serving significant time in federal prison.
Implying it wasn't genuine, perhaps?
Implying it was convenient, let's say. And Jane's statement similarly emphasized the terror she experienced and the feeling that she had essentially been financially bought and controlled. Both statements were this powerful, sobering reminder that while the 50-month sentence addresses the legal violation, it may never fully address the deep psychological and physical damage inflicted over many years.
And beyond the prison time, the financial consequences of this entire ordeal, they seem arguably just as devastating for Combs, aren't they? His business empire has suffered a staggering collapse.
The financial fallout is absolutely massive. That incredibly lucrative partnership with Diageo, the spirits giant, which was reportedly worth billions in potential value.
Yeah, Ciroc vodka, DeLeon tequila.
Exactly. That was severed completely. Diageo cited breach of contract and the immense reputational risk associated with Combs now. He was forced to step down from his leadership role at Revolt TV, the media company he founded. Bad Boy Records, his iconic label, has essentially suspended operations.
So his net worth must have plummeted.
Oh, drastically. It was estimated near $1 billion before all this started. Now, financial analysts estimate his net worth is likely somewhere between $400 million and $600 million. A catastrophic loss, driven by the collapse of his core businesses and undoubtedly astronomical legal fees defending both the criminal case and the upcoming civil ones.
Right, because the civil liability clock is still ticking very aggressively, isn't it? This isn't over for him financially.
Not by a long shot. He still faces over 70 pending civil lawsuits. 70. Alleging various forms of misconduct, sexual assault, harassment, financial impropriety spanning decades of his career.
And this criminal conviction helps those plaintiffs.
Tremendously. Legal experts are predicting his total civil liability exposure could easily range from $500 million, $500 million, potentially up to $1 billion or even more when all is said and done. The criminal conviction gives those civil plaintiffs significant leverage.
And finally, the defense immediately announced its plan to appeal the conviction, right? They're not accepting the 50 months.
No, they immediately signaled their intent to appeal. Their core argument is that the 50-month sentence is fundamentally excessive for Mann Act convictions, especially in the context of what they continue to frame as consensual adult relationships, despite his own admission of coercion at sentencing.
So what are the likely legal grounds for their appeal? What will they argue?
The appeal is almost certainly going to center heavily on that controversial issue we discussed. The judge's reliance on acquitted conduct during sentencing.
That's the big fight.
That's the big legal fight remaining. The defense will argue that admitting all that highly prejudicial evidence during the trial, like the graphic freak-off videos, the detailed trafficking testimony that the jury ultimately rejected, and then allowing the judge to use that same rejected evidence to significantly boost the sentence beyond what a simple Mann Act violation might warrant. They'll argue that Mann Act violated his constitutional rights.
Which specific rights?
Primarily, the argument implicates the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial. The core question is, if a jury of your peers found you not guilty of trafficking beyond a reasonable doubt, how can a judge then effectively impose a near-trafficking level sentence based on that same conduct, using only the lower preponderance of the evidence standard? It's a fundamental tension in the American justice system, and it's actually under heavy debate in legal circles right now, with some Supreme Court justices expressing concern about the practice. The defense will argue Judge Subramanian essentially usurped the jury's role and sentenced Combs for crimes he wasn't actually convicted of by the jury.
So that question, the reliance on acquitted conduct, that's really the primary legal avenue the defense has left to try and challenge or reduce that 50-month sentence.
It is. It's their main shot on appeal.
So wrapping this up, Sean Combs will serve federal prison time. He'll pay a substantial fine. He'll endure years of post-release supervision. This case, undeniably, has sent an unmistakable message of accountability, particularly within the celebrity sphere, the music world, the hip-hop industry specifically. It shows that immense fame and wealth offer no absolute shield from determined federal prosecution.
Absolutely. But beyond just the legal verdict and the prison sentence, I think this case forces us, as a society, to reckon with some really profound and uncomfortable questions. Questions about power, about the nature of consent, especially in asymmetrical relationships, and about the very function and limitations of the law itself.
How so?
Well, think about it. If significant financial control, like the $8K rent, and the immense power disparity that's just inherent in these kinds of celebrity relationships. If that creates an environment where victims feel psychologically compelled, maybe even trapped into participating in commercial sex acts, even if a jury, struggling with legal definitions, fails to meet that incredibly high beyond a reasonable doubt bar for trafficking, does the final sentence, 50 months, based fundamentally only on the transportation aspect, adequately address the scale of the broader harm? The harm that was so powerfully reflected in those victim impact statements.
That's the lingering question, isn't it? The gap between legal accountability and maybe moral or societal accountability?
It is. The legal system, the courts, they've rendered their decision on the specific criminal charges presented. That part is done, pending appeal. But the cultural reckoning, the ongoing civil litigation, the much broader societal examination of these power dynamics, particularly in the entertainment world, that feels like it's only just beginning.
A powerful point to end on. We will, of course, continue to follow the appeal process, the developments, and the many civil lawsuits as this unprecedented story continues to unfold and undoubtedly shape the future of legal accountability for high-profile figures.
It's a landmark case no matter how you look at it.
Thank you for joining us on this essential deep dive into the Sean Combs case, right here at the Urban Herald. We appreciate you tuning in.
Thanks for listening.
We'll be back soon with more comprehensive analysis on the stories that matter.